The weather out here is frightful, and this game is so delightful. The door almost didn't close. So could clothes, so could clothes, so could clothes. Hey, it's your friendly neighborhood potato witch. Welcome to the show. Ever since I played The Town of Light a few years ago, Wired Productions has been on my list of game publishers to really keep an eye on. After playing their steampunk-themed adventure horror game, Close to the Sun, I knew then and there that they were a company I needed a full collection of games by. I'll grant you, 2 games isn't always the best to make that sort of judgment on, but from my experience, they seem to publish thought-provoking games with narratives I could really sink my teeth into, and that was more than enough to get me interested. Close to the Sun was published in 2019 and developed by Storm in a Teacup, an Italian game dev group who also worked on Nero, Nothing Ever Remains Obscure, which I also own but haven't gotten around to playing yet. Maybe I'll have to bump the game further up on my playlist. It got some rather mixed reviews, with a lot of people praising the game's story, but expressing dislike for some of the game's mechanics and frustrating moments of trial and error gameplay. Myself, I can absolutely understand and agree with both of those sentiments, since the story was freaking phenomenal, but yeah, I really didn't like dying because I ran down the wrong path that I couldn't possibly have known not to go down. But overall, I love the game. It enthralled me when I first played it, and my time just flew right by when I replayed it to capture the footage for this review. Close to the Sun takes place in the very late 1800s, but an alternate history 1800s, where Nikola Tesla's technology is really taking off. Tesla has designed and built the Helios, a giant city ship where the brightest minds can congregate and work on solving all manner of humanity's problems, from bioengineering to improved energy production. You play as Rose Archer, a woman who was called to the Helios by her sister Ada. Ada's invitation letter doesn't give a whole lot of detail about why she wants Rose there, definitely very cryptic, but immediately after Rose arrives aboard the Helios, it becomes very clear that something is terribly, terribly wrong. As I mentioned, Close to the Sun is an action horror game, and the tense atmosphere ramps up really quickly. Rose steps through the main doors into the Helios and is greeted by a huge painted sign that reads "Quarantine." That's never a good thing. There are no people around, the place is eerily quiet, and while sometimes she sees the silhouettes and shadows of people beyond windows or around corners, she encounters nobody. Until she encounters corpses. Lots and lots of corpses, along with graffiti scrawled on the walls in what looks like blood. Time is not a river. The circle must be broken. At first, with some of the clues you find in early areas, it seems like this whole thing is a case of industrial espionage gone horribly wrong. But as the game progresses, you discover that the truth is so much more disturbing than that. Something that could shake the very fabric of reality until it comes crashing down. As Rose, you must traverse through the Helios, seeking not only your sister, but answers to the mystery of just what the hell happened here. The ship is an absolute shambles, wreckage all over the place, blockages you just can't get past, and to top it all off, there are these strange ghostly figures that sometimes show up, beings of golden light that seem to reenact snippets of past events that happened before disaster struck the ship. Sometimes they lead you in the right direction, other times they just echo a brief moment in their lives. What are they, and how do they relate to everything else that happened aboard this massive ship? Like any good adventure game, there are puzzles to be solved in order to progress, though some of the puzzle solving in this game is less "what do I do?" and more "how do I get to where I need to be to do what I need to do?" While you'd think this would lead to loads of backtracking and getting lost, the majority of the game is actually pretty straightforward to go through. Doors you aren't meant to go through are sealed off, hallways that don't concern you are blocked by rubble or piles of furniture, and while it can seem very open and intimidating at first, it really isn't too bad. That said, it's not so railroady that there's no sense in exploring a little. Scattered all over the ship are signs, documents, newspapers, all sorts of collectibles that give you greater insight into the lives and jobs of the ship's crew, what all these geniuses are doing on a huge ocean liner like the Helios. There are achievements for collecting all of these, so whether you're interested in deeper aspects of the game's story or just getting 100% completion, it's worth taking your time to look around when you can. Now, I said earlier that I could understand and agree with some player sentiments involving a dislike of some of the game's mechanics, and I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit here. See, while the game may be fairly straightforward most of the time, there are moments where it can get really frustrating. Most of the puzzles, for instance, just involve inputting codes that you can find written down in nearby documents, or flipping switches in the right order. Fairly simple stuff, enough to give the player a decent sense of accomplishment along the way, but nothing to really write home about. But there are times where I just wanted to bash my head off a wall over how utterly obtuse the solution of the puzzle was. Is obtuse the right word here? I'm not exactly sure. But, I mean, there was one moment where the solution to the puzzle was inside a small room in the residential area of the Helios, and I was absolutely lost on how to get there. I knew what I needed to do, I just didn't know where to do it. And the problem was that in my earlier explorations of the area, I had already tried the door to that room and found it inaccessible. So I continuously overlooked it as I tried to find the solution to my problem, because in pretty much every other circumstance, if an area of the game is inaccessible, it's because there's absolutely no need to go there, and nothing is even programmed to be there beyond a door and maybe some cool textures you can see through a gap. But no, I spent what felt like freaking forever wandering around, backtracking, and checking every interactable over and over, completely ignoring what I needed to actually do because the game had already given me indications that I didn't need to pay attention to that spot at all. Incredibly frustrating. There are also multiple moments in the game where you have to run away from enemies that are chasing you down, and that's where we enter a bit of trial and error gameplay. Sometimes you're going to be running back through an area you just came through, so you'll know which way to go. Other times, you're going to be running into unknown territory, vaulting over things and taking one branch of a pathway or the other, just hoping you pick the right one. If you get caught, you die. You immediately respawn just before the chase begins, so the only real drawback to dying is if you were gunning for a zero deaths run, but there were a few times in my playthrough that I didn't know if the reason I died was because I took the wrong path, because I didn't start running quickly enough, or because my finger slipped off the thumbstick for a split second, causing Rose to slow down. So do I try again on the same path, or try to pick a different way? Which is the right answer? Sometimes there are indications as to which way you're meant to go. Sometimes there are handy arrows drawn on the walls which direct you down the right hallways. But that's not always so handy when an arrow might be deliberately pointing you into a horrible flamey death. Or more importantly, when you're trying to concentrate on running away from swiftly approaching death and you might not have time or awareness to pay full attention to the environment as it zips by you. But for the most part, unless you're pretty familiar with the game or you get really lucky, you're gonna die here. Probably more than once. And I can absolutely see how that would frustrate a lot of players. Death in games is a punishment for doing something wrong, and even though the punishment here is pretty mild, since, as I said, you respawn with ease, it is still a punishment. And being punished because you made a mistake that you couldn't possibly know to not make does feel pretty unfair. And those chase segments are freaking tight. There is no room for error most of the time. One slip up, one moment of hesitation, one slight skid by the ladder you're trying to grab, and it's goodbye Rose. Though that did lead to a funny moment where I died right after I'd grabbed a ladder, and when I respawned, I was still in the ladder climbing pose. Backing up far enough made me shoot right back to the bottom of the ladder, which I was not near when I'd respawned. Kinda wish I'd kept moving forward though. Maybe I would have moved up too, and I could have clipped through the wall and explored a little out of bounds. Maybe something to try next time, I guess. But even when you're not being chased, the game is fantastic at building a really tense atmosphere. Any music that plays is really low-key, and often what you'll actually hear is ambient background noise, which adds to the eerie feel of the place. Even if there wasn't death and destruction everywhere, the very act of exploring an empty ship and trying to solve a mystery puts you quickly on edge, and it's rare that you get moments of feeling completely safe and secure. So, you spend the vast majority of the game completely alone, just you, no other characters around. It does become very clear that there are other people still alive on the Helios though, as after a time, your sister Ada starts communicating with you over radio signals. You'll also converse with a very strange man named Aubrey, and Tesla himself every now and again. But there comes a point where you really realize that you are not alone, and not to put too fine a point on it, but some of the people remaining on the ship mean you harm. Enter Ludwig, a man who is entirely too stab-happy for my liking, and who seems to have a serious grudge against Rose, chasing her down and shouting that it's all her fault, everything is her fault. Ludwig is one of those characters you have to run from, as I mentioned previously, so yes, you may end up dying at his hands and watching yourself get stabbed a few times for good measure. But what exactly is he blaming Rose for? Things are going to get a bit spoilery from here on out, so be warned, if you want to experience the game for yourself and don't want any of the story ruined, then feel free to skip to this timestamp. Okay, we good? So, a lot of the work being done aboard the Helios was about energy production, coming up with ways to provide cheap and abundant electricity to the world. They come up with a way to do this by harvesting energy from time itself. It was Ada's brilliant research that allowed this breakthrough, so kudos to your genius sister. Unfortunately, this process creates a byproduct known as exotic energy, which gives rise to terrifying monsters known only as time anomalies. Which, if you ask me, is way too benign a name for a creature that can stab through your body and then start eating your face off. But I wasn't put in charge of naming them, so... Something has gone deeply wrong with the experiments, though, and a rift has formed, causing all of the damage on board the ship and allowing the exotic energy to escape. Hence why there are so many corpses around, people killed by vicious time anomalies. With time itself no longer stable, things are looping back on themselves. Time, you might say, isn't a river flowing in one direction, but is in fact a circle which needs to be broken. Rose went to the Helios to find and save her sister, only to see Ada killed by a time anomaly. But at the end of the game, after you defeat the antagonist and escape the destruction of the Helios, the voice of Tesla tells you that he's figured out a way to save Ada, to bring her back. When I first saw that, I was like, come on, don't just end on a cliffhanger. But then I realized... it wasn't a cliffhanger. It was foreshadowing. Tesla's solution is to use Ada's research to save her, which pretty much means using the fact that time is looping back on itself to go back and try and change the past, to uncover some variant of the timeline in which Rose can rescue Ada and her brilliant mind, and all her work can be saved, and she can keep working for the advancement of humanity. Why is Ludwig so pissed off at Rose? Because he's aware that he is caught in a time loop, and that he has spent who knows how many iterations of himself watching the experiments get out of control, watching people die, watching Rose come and try to save her sister, only to fail and try again and start the whole cycle over once more. He's lost his hold on sanity at that point. He is desperate to do anything that will stop the cycle, and the only thing he has any control over is whether or not he can kill Rose to stop her from coming back. But here's the sneaky thing about multiverse theory and time loops. It doesn't work that way. At one point, Rose sees a ghostly echo of herself carrying her sister's body and laying it to rest in a flower garden. Ada's body is most definitely there, but Rose didn't carry her there, and we don't see her do that in the game. That's confirmation right there that the looping timeline isn't constant, that things can be changed. So if there are so many variables, so many potential Roses to come back and do things a little differently each time, trying different things that might save her sister, then even if Ludwig kills Rose, he's only killing one version of Rose. There are others. There will always be others until something happens to prevent the time loop from ever happening to begin with. But you want to know the really mind-bendy part? That makes all of your deaths canon. Every time you died, it was Rose actually dying. Coming back, doing something slightly different in order to carry on, well, that's just the multiverse in a nutshell, isn't it? All of those deaths, whether at the hands of Ludwig, time anomalies, or just slipping off a platform and drowning in deep water, they all really happened. Yeah, kinda puts a different spin on the game, huh? While the character models in Close to the Sun are not so great, the environment itself is just gorgeous, and some of the sets are simply breathtaking. It is so easy to imagine what the Helios must have been like at the height of its grandeur, catering to the brightest minds of the time and giving them a life of luxury where they could pursue their work without worries about such mundane problems as food and shelter and money. Kind of a shame it backfired on them so horribly. There are so many mysteries to solve in Close to the Sun too, and not all of them are obvious and plot related. For instance, there's a coded message that you'll probably eventually come across, with clues to the cipher written all over the room. It's possible to put the pieces together, and what you end up with isn't a cool piece of lore so much as a note from the developers congratulating you on solving the puzzle. Even if it's entirely pointless and breaks the fourth wall, stuff like that just makes me grin. Or how about the mystery of those strange green symbols that are painted throughout the ship? Or maybe it's not exactly paint, because I don't know of any paint that swirls around like that, but you know what I mean. The same symbol also shows up on messages that are sent to Rose through the ship's pneumatic tube system, messages that seem to indicate that the sender knows what's going on and is trying to guide Rose in the right direction. You do get very, very strong hints as to what's going on with those messages towards the end of the game, but as for the green symbols themselves, what they're made of and who put them there, that doesn't get explicitly stated in the game, at least so far as I could tell. Little mysteries to craft theories about, I guess. I definitely recommend Close to the Sun if you're a fan of tense adventure games with a generous splash of horror, or are just on the lookout for a game that plays with some uncommon story elements and has a deep and interesting narrative. The story presentation was top-notch, the ambient soundtrack was perfectly fitting the mood at every turn, and even if some of the mechanics frustrated me, it was never anything that I couldn't deal with in the end. Never anything that made me so annoyed that it soured me on the rest of the game. I mean, obviously, because I finished it twice and I'm now telling you all to give it a try if you can. It's a challenge at times, but it's still decently forgiving, and I just loved the story that it told and the way it pulled me along and made me deeply invested in Rose and her quest to find Ada and escape the Helios. Close to the Sun is an underrated little gem, and I cannot recommend it enough. Just be careful of the implications of playing it. You might be contributing to Ludwig losing his mind that much faster. Hey, thanks for watching the video! I hope you enjoyed my ramblings on this disturbing and delightful indie game, and if you did enjoy it, let me know by clicking that like button, or leaving me a comment. Comments are always good, and I'd love to know if you've played Close to the Sun and what you thought about it. If you want to see what videos I'll be working on in the future, go ahead and click that subscribe button, and maybe the little notification bell thingy so you don't miss any uploads. Or not, that's cool too. Either way, stay safe and happy gaming!